My name is Arthur Bennett, and I turned 72 last spring. Most people my age spend their days enjoying retirement, surrounded by grandchildren and peaceful memories. I had imagined something similar for myself. Instead, the most humiliating moment of my life happened at my only daughter's wedding. The groom shoved my face into a wedding cake worth thousands of dollars, while more than 300 guests watched. His friends laughed. Some even applauded. He called me a poor old freeloader, who should be grateful he had been invited. What he never bothered to learn was that I owned the ballroom where the wedding was being held. But before I explain how everything unraveled, let me tell you how it all began. The ceremony took place inside the magnificent Crystal Crown Ballroom, a venue famous for its elegant chandeliers, marble floors, and towering glass windows that overlooked the city skyline. Every detail reflected luxury. Fresh white roses lined the entrance, crystal centerpieces sparkled beneath golden lights, and a string quartet played softly as guests admired the decorations. I stood quietly near the back of the hall. My dark gray suit was old but spotless. My polished leather shoes had been repaired more than once, yet they remained comfortable. To everyone around me, I looked like an aging father who had struggled through life and barely managed to attend his daughter's expensive wedding. That illusion suited me perfectly. Across the room stood my daughter, Emily Bennett, glowing in her white gown. She smiled for photographers, greeted relatives, and accepted compliments with practiced grace. Yet every time our eyes met, her smile weakened just enough for me to notice. Beside her was the groom, Damien Cole, tall, confident, and dressed in an immaculate custom tuxedo. Damien carried himself like a man convinced the world belonged to him. He greeted influential guests by name, laughed loudly at his own jokes, and constantly adjusted his expensive watch as though everyone should admire it. Whenever he looked toward me, his expression changed. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hatred. It was something colder. To him, I was an inconvenient reminder that his future father-in-law didn't fit the wealthy image he wanted to present. I had noticed his attitude months earlier, but today it had become impossible to ignore. When the master of ceremonies invited me to give the father of the bride's speech, polite applause filled the ballroom. I walked slowly to the stage. My knees weren't as strong as they once were, but my voice remained steady. I remember the day Emily was born, I began. She was so tiny that she wrapped her entire hand around one of my fingers. The room grew quiet. I promised her mother that no matter what happened in life, I'd always protect our little girl. Emily lowered her eyes. I hope your marriage is built on honesty, kindness, patience, and respect. Wealth comes and goes, success changes, beauty fades with time, but character stays with you forever. I paused before smiling gently. I wish you both a lifetime filled with genuine happiness. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was sincere. I stepped away from the microphone. Then Damien walked onto the stage. He clapped slowly, wearing an amused smile. "Beautiful speech," he said into the microphone. "Very emotional." Several guests chuckled. I almost cried myself. More laughter spread across the ballroom. Damien turned toward me. "You know what I like most about Arthur?" He waited dramatically. "He reminds us that money isn't everything." People smiled politely. "Sometimes," he continued, "it's also important to remember what happens when you don't have any." His closest friends burst into laughter. I remained silent. Emily shifted uncomfortably beside him. Damien wrapped an arm around her shoulders possessively before pointing toward the enormous 7-tier wedding cake decorated with handcrafted sugar flowers. "Let's make some unforgettable memories." The photographer eagerly moved closer. Guests gathered around the cake, raising their phones. Damien sliced the first piece together with Emily while cameras flashed from every direction. Then, instead of feeding his bride, he lifted the plate and slowly walked toward me. His grin widened. "You've probably never tasted dessert this expensive," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. Before I could answer, his hand grabbed the back of my head. Everything happened in a single second. Cold frosting, crushing cake, ladder exploded throughout the ballroom. My face disappeared into layers of cream, icing, and shattered decorations. Someone whistled. Someone applauded. As Damien pulled my head back, frosting dripped from my face onto my jacket. He leaned close enough that only those nearest could hear. "Know your place, old man," he whispered. The laughter continued. Then a powerful voice thundered across the silent ballroom. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The laughter faded almost instantly. Every head turned toward the far end of the ballroom, where an elderly gentleman had risen from his seat with unmistakable authority. His tailored navy suit, silver hair, and commanding presence silenced the crowd without another word. It was Richard Sterling. Nearly everyone in the room recognized him. He was one of the country's most respected real estate developers, a man whose name appeared in business magazines and charity galas alike. Damien had spent months trying to introduce himself to Richard, hoping to earn his favor. Now Richard was staring directly at him. "What kind of man humiliates his wife's father on his wedding day?" he demanded. Damien forced an awkward smile. "Sir, it was only a joke." "A joke?" Richard's voice echoed across the ballroom. "You call assaulting a respected man a joke?" The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Damien glanced toward Emily for support, but she stood frozen, unable to speak. Richard slowly pointed toward me. "Do you people even know who this man is?" Nobody answered. Damien laughed nervously. "He's Arthur, Emily's dad." Richard shook his head in disbelief. "No." He took another step forward. "He is Arthur Bennett, founder of Bennett Developments." Whispers swept across the ballroom. "The same Bennett Developments that built half the commercial district in this city." More whispers. "The same Arthur Bennett who owns the Crystal Crown Ballroom where you're standing." A collective gasp filled the room. Damien's confident smile disappeared. He looked from Richard to me and back again, searching for someone to deny the claim. Nobody did. I calmly removed a folded white handkerchief from my jacket pocket and wiped the frosting from my face. Slowly, carefully, without saying a word. The silence became almost unbearable. Only after cleaning my glasses did I finally raise my head. "I'm afraid Mr. Sterling is correct." The room seemed frozen. "I founded Bennett Developments 46 years ago." I looked directly at Damien. "And yes," I paused, "I still own this ballroom." His face drained of color. "But," he stammered, I thought you thought I was poor." He couldn't answer. I folded my handkerchief neatly and returned it to my pocket. "I've spent the last decade living quietly outside the city." Curious faces watched every movement. "I sold many of my personal luxuries years ago after my wife passed away." A painful silence settled over the room. "When my wife Margaret lost her battle with cancer, I discovered something important." I looked toward the wedding cake lying in ruins. "Money cannot buy one more conversation with the person you love. It cannot purchase another sunrise together. It cannot stop time." So I walked away from the lifestyle everyone admired. Several guests lowered their eyes. I moved into the small lakeside home my wife and I built with our own hands before success changed our lives. It wasn't large. It wasn't fashionable. But every room held memories. I smiled faintly. "That's worth far more than marble floors and imported chandeliers." Richard nodded quietly. I continued. "My daughter always understood that." I looked at Emily. "When she was little, she loved riding beside me in my old pickup truck." A tear rolled down her cheek. "She used to say it smelled like home." For the first time since the incident, she covered her face. But somewhere along the way, I sighed. "She started believing appearances mattered more than character." Nobody interrupted. I noticed the changes slowly. It began with small comments. "Dad, maybe you should buy a newer truck, Dad. Maybe wear something more expensive when you meet Damien's parents. Dad." People might misunderstand. Each sentence hurt more than the last, not because she wanted nicer things, because she had begun judging people by them. Then came the money. First a few $100s, then several thousand. Always for designer clothes, luxury vacations, exclusive parties, private clubs, expensive gifts. Every request carried Damien's fingerprints. I never refused. Not because they needed the money, because I wanted to see how far greed would travel if nobody challenged it. Richard folded his arms. "I warned Arthur this day might come," he admitted, "but he hoped he was wrong." I nodded. I wanted to believe Damien loved my daughter. I prayed I had misjudged him. My eyes settled on Damien once again, but today answered every question. Damien swallowed hard. His confidence had completely vanished. I didn't know, no. I interrupted calmly. You never cared enough to ask. The ballroom remained silent. Every guest now understood the truth. The humble old man they had ignored all afternoon had never been poor. He had simply chosen a different way to live. And the groom who had mocked him had just humiliated himself in front of everyone who mattered. Damien stood motionless, his expensive tuxedo suddenly looking like nothing more than an expensive costume. The confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. Around the ballroom, guests whispered among themselves. Some quietly stepped away from Damien and his family, unwilling to be associated with the spectacle unfolding before them. Emily remained frozen. Tears streamed down her face, but she still couldn't find the courage to speak. I looked around the room before addressing everyone. I never hid my identity, I said calmly. I simply stopped advertising it. A few guests exchanged embarrassed glances. People assumed I was poor because I drove an old pickup truck, lived in a modest house, and wore simple clothes. I smiled faintly. I never corrected them. Richard folded his arms. Arthur has always believed a person's character reveals itself when they think no one important is watching. I nodded. Exactly. Years ago, after Margaret passed away, I created a different life for myself. I stepped away from public attention. The company continued to thrive under experienced executives, while I focused on quieter things. Fishing at sunrise, repairing my own fence, reading on my porch, visiting my wife's favorite places. Those moments brought me more happiness than any luxury ever had. Damien suddenly found his voice. If that's true, he swallowed nervously. Why let everyone think you had nothing? I looked directly at him. Because wealth attracts the wrong people. Silence answered me. I wanted to know who valued me as a father, and who valued me as a bank account. Several guests slowly lowered their eyes. I hoped the man my daughter married would care about kindness more than inheritance. I paused. Instead, my gaze settled on Damien. He measured human worth by cars, watches, and clothing. Emily finally spoke, cracked. I'm sorry. I looked at her gently but didn't answer. Some apologies come too early, others come too late. At that moment, the ballroom doors opened once again. A confident woman in a charcoal business suit walked inside carrying a leather portfolio. Every step she took reflected discipline and purpose. She stopped beside me. Good evening, she said politely. My name is Victoria Hayes. I serve as Mr. Bennett's legal advisor. Damien frowned. What is this? Victoria ignored him. She opened her portfolio and handed me several documents before turning toward the audience. I believe a few misunderstandings require clarification. The ballroom projector suddenly illuminated. The romantic wedding slideshow disappeared. In its place appeared official legal documents. Victoria pointed toward the screen. This property, she indicated the ownership certificate, is legally owned by Bennett Heritage Holdings. Several guests leaned forward. Mr. Bennett remains sole controlling owner. Another page appeared. This evening's venue rental, she smiled politely, was never charged to the bride or groom. Confused murmurs spread across the room. The ballroom, catering, decorations, security, entertainment, and wedding staff were provided at Mr. Bennett's personal expense. Damien blinked repeatedly. What? Victoria continued without emotion. The total cost exceeded $600,000. Someone gasped loudly. Emily stared at me in disbelief. You paid for everything? I nodded once. You insisted you wanted the Crystal Crown Ballroom, so I made sure you had it. Damien looked completely stunned, but he struggled to form a sentence. I thought Emily's family couldn't afford. Victoria interrupted him. You assumed. She changed the slide. A financial chart appeared. This concerns the Cole family. Damien's parents suddenly became nervous. Victoria continued. Our investigators reviewed publicly available financial records. Another document appeared. Outstanding loans. Another. Overdue commercial debt. Another. Mortgaged assets. The room became deathly quiet. The Cole family currently owes more than $28 million. A woman near the front covered her mouth. Victoria continued calmly. Multiple loan applications have recently been denied. Damien's father stared at the floor. His mother looked ready to faint. Victoria closed her folder. It appears this marriage was expected to solve certain financial difficulties. Damien finally exploded. That's ridiculous, is it? Victoria held up another document. This is the prenuptial agreement prepared by your attorneys. Emily's face turned pale. I recognized the document immediately. Victoria highlighted one paragraph. It grants Mr. Cole 50% of any inheritance received during the marriage. Nobody spoke. She looked directly at Damien. You weren't marrying for love. You were investing in what you believed would become a fortune. The silence became unbearable. Every illusion Damien had carefully built throughout the years collapsed within minutes. And this was only the beginning. The ballroom was so quiet that the faint hum of the air conditioning became impossible to ignore. Damien stood speechless, staring at the projection screen as though willing the documents to disappear. They're fake, he finally muttered. Victoria Hayes calmly adjusted her glasses. They were obtained through public financial records, court filings, and banking disclosures. Every page has been verified. Damien's father rose from his chair. That's private information. Victoria met his glare without flinching. No, sir. Debt recorded in public filings is available to anyone willing to look. His shoulders slumped as he slowly sat back down. The room had already reached its verdict. I stepped forward. This was never about money. Every eye turned toward me. If Damien had loved my daughter with honesty, I would have welcomed him into my family. I paused. I would have helped him build a future. Emily looked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. You would have? I have spent my entire life helping hard-working people succeed. I smiled sadly. I've financed young entrepreneurs, paid for scholarships, and donated millions to hospitals. I looked directly at Damien, but I never reward greed. Victoria displayed another document on the screen. This is the Bennett Heritage Trust. Several guests leaned forward. The trust controls Mr. Bennett's business interests, investment portfolio, and real estate. She turned another page. According to its terms, none of these assets pass directly to family members. Damien frowned. What does that mean? It means, Victoria answered calmly, there is no personal fortune waiting to be inherited. Confused whispers spread throughout the ballroom. I explained. After Margaret passed away, I placed nearly everything into charitable trusts. The income supports children's hospitals, vocational schools, housing projects for veterans, and medical research. Another document appeared. My lakeside home will eventually become a recovery retreat for families with critically ill children. Emily covered her mouth. You never told me. You never asked. Those 4 words struck harder than anything else I had said that evening. Damien's breathing became uneven. So, he swallowed, there isn't anything? There is dignity, I replied. There is purpose. There is a legacy built on service. But if you're asking whether there is a fortune waiting for you, I slowly shook my head. No. The realization shattered him. Everything he had planned, every calculation, every insult, every demand, every performance, had been based on an illusion. Richard Sterling let out a quiet sigh. I've watched Arthur build buildings that changed this city. He looked around the room. But the greatest thing he ever built was his character. Nobody disagreed. Emily slowly walked toward me. Dad. Her voice trembled. I made terrible mistakes. I remained silent. She stopped only a few feet away. I stopped listening to you. I cared too much about appearances. I believed things that weren't true. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. I let someone convince me that success was measured by expensive cars and designer labels. She looked toward Damien. I defended him. She lowered her head. And I failed you. The room waited for my response. I spoke gently. Emily, you were not forced to make those choices. You made them yourself. She nodded through her tears. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I only wanted you to hear me say it. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, I took a slow breath. I will always love you. Her eyes filled with hope. But love does not erase consequences. The hope faded. Trust, I continued, takes years to build. It can disappear in a single moment. She quietly nodded. I understand. Behind us, Damien suddenly rushed forward. Emily. She turned. We can fix this. No, she answered softly. We can start over. She looked at him with heartbreaking disappointment. There was never an us. There was only what you thought my father owned. Damien reached for her hand. She stepped back. I'm done. Security staff quietly approached after receiving a discreet signal from the venue manager. Damien looked around desperately. Nobody defended him, not his friends, not his parents, not even Emily. His carefully constructed image had collapsed before hundreds of witnesses. Without another word, he allowed security to escort him toward the ballroom entrance. The massive doors closed behind him. For the first time that evening, the room felt peaceful. No one moved for several moments after Damien left the ballroom. The musicians quietly lowered their instruments. Conversations faded into silence as the guests struggled to process everything they had witnessed. What had begun as a lavish wedding celebration had become a lesson no one present would ever forget. I looked around the room. "I owe all of you an apology," I said calmly. "You came here expecting to celebrate two people beginning a new life together. Instead, you found yourselves caught in a painful family matter." Several guests shook their heads. One elderly woman smiled gently. "No, Mr. Bennett," she said. "We witnessed the truth." Others nodded in agreement. I turned toward the wedding staff. Every waiter, chef, musician, florist, and cleaner had continued doing their jobs despite the chaos unfolding around them. They deserved better. I looked at Victoria. "Please make sure every employee working tonight receives a bonus equal to twice their evening's pay." She smiled. "It will be done," I continued. "Cancel nothing else." Several guests looked confused. "The meals have already been prepared. The flowers are already here. The musicians have honored their commitment." I smiled warmly. No one's hard work should be wasted because of someone else's poor character. The atmosphere slowly softened. Guests returned to their tables. Conversations resumed. People who had arrived expecting a wedding shared dinner instead, appreciating the kindness that remained after the bitterness had passed. Richard walked beside me. "You handled that better than anyone else could have." I smiled. "I've spent my life building structures," he chuckled. "And tonight I protected one." He understood exactly what I meant. Not a building, a legacy. Over the following weeks, life changed in ways I never expected. The newspapers briefly covered the dramatic events of the interrupted wedding, but public attention faded quickly. My peace returned. Every morning I sat on my porch overlooking the lake with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise reflect across the still water. Margaret had loved those mornings. Sometimes I could almost imagine her sitting beside me, smiling as she always had. About 3 months later, there was a gentle knock at my front door. When I opened it, Emily stood outside. She looked different. Gone were the designer handbags, expensive jewelry, and carefully perfected appearance. She wore simple clothes, no makeup, no pretense, only humility. She held a small cardboard box. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." I stepped aside. "You came." She entered quietly. The house looked exactly as it always had, the stone fireplace, the handmade oak shelves, the photographs of Margaret. Nothing had changed. Emily slowly placed the box on the dining table. "I found these while cleaning my apartment." Inside were old family photographs, a faded baseball glove, my daughter's childhood drawings, a tiny wooden birdhouse we had built together decades earlier. She picked it up carefully. "I almost threw this away once." Her voice cracked. "I can't believe I ever thought these things had no value." I looked at the birdhouse. "It was never worth much money." She smiled sadly. "I know, it was worth something far greater." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she whispered, "I've started volunteering at the Children's Hospital your trust supports." I looked at her with quiet surprise. I wanted to understand why Mom always believed helping people mattered more than impressing them. A tear rolled down her cheek. "I think I'm finally beginning to understand." I nodded slowly. "Your mother would have been proud of that choice." Emily wiped her eyes. "I don't expect everything to go back to the way it was." "It won't," I answered honestly, nodded. "I know, but maybe." She hesitated. "We can build something new." I smiled for the first time in months. Strong buildings aren't created by pretending the cracks never existed. She listened carefully. "They're rebuilt by repairing the foundation." Emily stepped forward and hugged me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Some wounds never disappear completely, but healing always begins with truth. As the sun set over the lake that evening, I realized something Margaret had understood long before I did. Real wealth isn't measured by property, investments, or luxury. It is measured by the people whose lives become better because you were part of them. Money can build magnificent buildings. Character builds families. Respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned. And while greed can destroy relationships in a single afternoon, honesty, humility, and forgiveness can slowly build them again, one careful step at a time. That is the legacy I hope my daughter carries forward. Not my company, not my fortune, but the values that made both possible.